everyone, and welcome back to McFly's Movie House. I'm your host, Marta McFly, and for today's episode, I am feeling excited. I am feeling invigorated. It's going to be such a good one. For those of you who don't know, I'm a huge fan of Jacques Demy. His movies have such a soft spot in my heart, and for the most part, they just never fail to put me in a cinematic mood, the sort of mood you feel when you're like the main character, and that's because of just the worlds that he so perfectly crafts and that you see on camera. So for today's chat, I thought it would be cool to highlight 3 films by him, 3 that make up a unofficial romance trilogy, and those are Lola, which is his feature film debut, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, and The Young Girls of Rochefort, which is my personal favorite. But anyway, to help me out today, I invited Ash Laskey to the podcast, along with being a good friend of mine. She also runs her own movie podcast, the Love, Death, and Movies podcast, with 2 other phenomenal co-hosts. Shout out to Byron and Harry. But besides her work on the pod, she's also a film content creator, which is how we connected. So without further ado, hello, my friend. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to talk about these movies.
Thank you for being here. I'm also equally excited. I remember it was ages ago that you checked out The Umbrellas of Cherbourg after I was just raving about it, and then you connected with it. I know you're a huge fan of La La Land, and there's a connection there that we'll obviously get into, but it just seemed like the perfect fit for us to pick Demy as our first subject, right? What do you think?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I think you had been telling me about The Young Girls for a long time because we were talking about musicals and La La Land. And yeah, I don't know why I watched Umbrellas first. I think I just took forever to get to the other ones. But yes, so happy now to have seen all 3 of these.
Perfect. Well, to break down the episode for you and for listeners, we're going to first give a general overview of Demy's career, because I think he's such an interesting filmmaker. And then we'll run through the 3 films that I mentioned, so Lola, Umbrellas, and Young Girls. And then we're going to summarize them, chat about why we love them so much, you know, maybe dig into some background production information if people are interested in that. But how does that sound?
Sounds great.
Perfect. Well, before we get into it, I love asking my guests to highlight what they've watched recently in the past little while and if they recommend anything to me and to everybody listening.
Yeah. Oh gosh, let's see. Okay. I've been doing a lot of rewatches. So I'm trying to think of the couple that I recently watched. Well, I know you've seen it, but I watched Frances Ha for the second time recently.
Yes.
Absolutely loved it. I bumped it up to a 5. Just like unlike any other movie, I feel like it's like coming of age, but it's just so unique in the way that it tackles like that young adulthood coming of age versus like high school coming of age. And obviously Greta Gerwig plays it perfectly. And I love the way that it tackles like female friendships and how those shift through your 20s. So that's always a fun one to recommend to people. It's not going to be for everybody, but it's a really well done
It's for
film.
us.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. One that I recently watched, I think you've seen, was Face Off. I've never seen this movie until last weekend. It was an experience, and I was not ready for like how over the top it was, which it makes sense with the type of plot that it has, but nothing can prepare you for that movie.
For John Travolta playing Nick Cage and Nick Cage playing John Travolta.
Yeah.
It's everything.
I think Nick Cage does a really good job at playing that type of character. I think it was tougher for him to play like someone like John Travolta's like normal character, but John Travolta as Nick Cage was cracking me up. So
amazing.
Loved it. But then everything else is pretty much rewatches. I would say those are the 2 main ones. I did recently watch also the Ted TV show. I just finished that, and that's fun. So if you like that type of like 90s sitcom Seth MacFarlane, then I would recommend that to people who enjoy that. Cool. I'm not sure if that's up your alley, but it was fun.
It can be. It can be. I've been rewatching The King of the Hill a lot lately as like my wind down. So yeah. But should we dive into Demy then?
Sure.
Perfect. So Jacques Demy, he was a French filmmaker. He rose to prominence around the time that some of his French New Wave contemporaries were, so the early 60s, that sort of thing. And film critics usually put him on the periphery of the New Wave movement, which consisted of rejecting the ways in which big studios made films. So they weren't lavish, they weren't done on massive studio budgets, and they were very improvisational. So not shot in studios themselves, but filmed literally in the real world on location. So with that, the editing was either very fragmented or consisted of very long takes, just a new approach to filmmaking at the time. And I mean, we can do an entire episode on that movement in itself. But so anyway, Demy shows up and he embraced a lot of Hollywood's golden age, particularly musicals. So he injected his movies with melodrama. He incorporated, like we said, musicals. He just carried a lot of love for Hollywood during this era. And yet what some folks forget is that he still injects new wave pockets into his work. And we'll get into that later on. But for example, his first two features, Lola and Bay of Angels, I mean, those are very much so clear examples of the French New Wave when you compare them to his more colorful works like Umbrellas and Young Girls. And then he was also married to Agnes Varda, who was notably a part of the left bank in the New Wave movement. So that ties him into that group. But Ash, have you seen anything by Varda? Just out of my own curiosity, her movies are phenomenal.
I have not.
No, yeah, definitely. I would check out Le Bonheur or Cleo from 5 to 7. Those are really great. But yeah, overall, so his films just carry that sort of self-reflective quality that was found in the New Wave films at the time. And that's kind of why I love them so much, because they still are a part of that movement, yet they're also less pretentious from what his contemporaries were doing. And don't get me wrong, I love the French New Wave. I'm all for pretentious cinema sometimes, but it's just a breath of fresh air that feels vibrant and it feels fun. And I was reading, interestingly enough, fairy tales are a huge influence on Demy. So we'll chat about that too, but also in films like Donkey Skin, notably. Have you seen that one, Ash?
Mm-mm.
No, it's also a good one. That one's like a pure fairy tale. But so I was reading that even when he was a child, that's when his interest in fairy tales developed. So he actually created a puppet theater, and it was above his father's garage. And he would create fairy tale plays that they were just super sweet as a child. And then at 13, he bought a camera. He started making films. There's a lovely interview with him where he explains how around this time he was also interested in music and in painting. And I say all these things because he combines all these things later on in his work. And he believed that visuals were just as important as the story itself, as was music. And I mean, I can babble on about this for hours because I just love him so much, but I'm probably going to wrap up the overview. So when Demy passed away in 1990, that's when a resurgence of his movies came back, particularly in the mid-90s. Also notably within that, the queer community and the wave of directors in French queer cinema, such as François Ozon and Jacques Martineau. And Demy himself was bisexual, and many of these filmmakers highlight his queer eye or approach to filmmaking, which really resonates with them too. So with that, his widow Varda, she also put an emphasis on restoring his films. She did some documentaries on them as well. It's just sublime. So yeah, Demy, he has a collection of shorts and 13 feature-length films. It's a very varied filmography, no doubt, but he still has these like reoccurring themes throughout that are kind of a through line through his work, like absence or missed connections or just this overall theme of like melancholy, even when they look as bright as they do. And we'll talk about that more. But Ash, does that give you a better overview, I guess, of like his world?
It definitely does. I feel like it kind of makes sense, especially the fairy tale aspect. I feel like that explains a lot about the relationships that are in these movies.
Totally. Yeah. So I guess let's just jump into our first Demy film of the day. So that's Lola from 1961. Also his feature film debut. I think I mentioned that earlier. But to give us a general overview, I'm just going to read the letterbox description. So that states, a bored young man meets with his former girlfriend, now a cabaret dancer and single mother, and soon finds himself falling back in love with her. That's basically it, right?
Yeah, that really summarizes it well, honestly.
Honestly. So as I mentioned, this is seen as the part or the start of the Informal Romance Trilogy next to Umbrellas and the Young Girls. And when I say informal, I mean they'll contain either some of the same characters or actors or just these like subtle connections that you spot and which are fun to spot. I mean, Roland, the lead here, played by Marc Michel, he ends up popping up again in Umbrellas of Cherbourg as a suitor for Catherine Deneuve's character Geneviève. And then the character of Lola herself, I think her name is Anouk Aimée, the actress, but she's referenced in the musical numbers as Lola Lola in the Young Girls of Rochefort. So she I think also makes an appearance later on in Model Shop, which is another one of his movies, but we're not talking about that today. But now that you've seen all three films, did you make these connections?
Yes, I made the one about Roland, obviously. I think I messaged you about that one because I was like, wait, okay, this makes so much sense.
Blowing your mind, yeah.
And even like the flashback, obviously we can get more into them, but the flashback of when he's talking about how he got to where he is, I mean, that is like the whole shot from Lola as well. I'm not sure what you'd call that little like town center kind of area, you know, where they're panning around. But yeah, that was the most notable one to me. But I did pick up on the song that mentions Lola as well.
Which is heartbreaking. I mean, we'll get into that later, but when you hear what happens to her, I'm like, really? That's how you chose to end this like colorful character's life?
Yeah.
But yeah, so with Lola, it's his debut. And like we were saying, he just created this cinematic universe that so many of us have grown to love. And I just personally find that so exciting that he just burst onto the scene with this like distinct style and just a flair and through line to his later works. There's even a quote by him that I was reading, or no, is it in the book that I was reading or the film? Anyways, no, it's in Lola itself. I think one of the characters says, "There's happiness in simply wanting happiness." And that to me is a perfect representation of the worldview that's then repeated in the other movies of the trilogy. So all centering on these misconnections and chance encounters. And I think Lola really succeeds is it shows us not to be pessimistic about our past choices, as things don't always work out. But in Demy's world, our leads recall the past and choose to take responsibility for it. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So with Lola, the result does veer into the optimistic because we know how it ends. But then with the Umbrellas of Cherbourg, it doesn't. And these are all just showing how these characters end up. Are they keeping faith? Are they not, you know?
Yeah, I think all three of them have like their own different types of endings that can kind of be relatable for so many different types of people, because I feel like a lot of them do kind of encompass fairy tale like thinking. But at the end of the day, there is like, there's some kind of optimism here. There's sort of like missed opportunity, possibly your life going a different way there. And even just with Young Girls even ending kind of like not really sure what's going to happen in the future. So it kind of tackles like multiple different things in that kind of sphere that you're talking about.
And I don't know if you would agree, but I think it's the relatability of those love stories that speaks to so many fans, because so many of us have experienced that sort of doomed love or the one who got away. And I think that viewers who wander through more of life's lessons, they can revisit these movies, the trilogy itself, and they'll always be able to bring up parallel experiences, don't you think?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I was like writing down some things and I wrote the word parallel so many times of just like, I think that's, it's just a great way of putting it. And I think they all bring something different, which is really fun to watch them. Like I watched them all in one day. So I had a lot of fun just like kind of seeing the differences between them, but how they all kind of have that same undertone.
Yeah. So with Lola, it was actually supposed to be a musical as well, but Demy couldn't find the funding for such a big scale production, and he had to shorten the script. He also had to shoot in black and white. That wasn't his intention. Yet it's still a very incredibly musical movie, if you will. I mean, Michel Legrand's score is phenomenal, as it is in the other two movies that he later works on. I think there's also the usage of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, but that just like swells up in all like the most perfect moments. And Demy actually dubbed Lola a musical without a musical. And I think that's very true. You get this rhythmic sort of talking with the characters. We also get that quick musical number with Lola herself.
Yeah.
That was actually written by Varda, Demy's wife. And man, that song has been stuck in my head. I watched Lola, I don't know, maybe like a week ago now. It's been stuck in my head all week. It's so good. And then also don't forget the reference of the sailors who roam the streets, which we'll see again in Young Girls. But that to me, I mean, I could be wrong, but that to me seems like a reference to the MGM musical by Stanley Donen, On the Town, starring Gene Kelly. And then Gene Kelly later appears in the Young Girls. So, I mean, it is musical.
Yeah, and it is interesting that he kind of has that, he has aspects of the, like the sailors in all three of these films. And it's all in different ways. But they all feel connected worlds, like you said. It is like a little cinematic universe, even though they're not like characters that maybe all directly know each other. It is kind of a fun like thing to do, because you don't find that super often where movies intertwine, but they're not direct trilogies or, you know, sequels and things like that.
I love it. I think it's fantastic. And I mean, it was also, along with being its own built up universe, it was also autobiographical for Demy too. I mean, it was shot in his hometown of Nantes. The older women who are always at the cafe that Roland frequents, they were inspired by Demy's aunts and like the conversations that he used to have with his aunts, or that he listened to them have.
That makes so much sense. They felt very much like Yeah, like this guy is just like, I'm bored. I don't want to work. I don't know why I'm working. Like just kind of coming in and these old ladies are kind of just like trying to talk some sense into him and listening to his problems. I love that.
Totally. And some critics, I mean, I don't know this, I'll just say this allegedly, but some critics say that Roland is Demy's alter ego. So that could be interesting. I don't know much about that. But yeah, so as we were saying earlier, just to kind of circle back to that, the movie does contain the themes of chance, of misconnections, and it does a good job of mirroring certain characters and representing that free will and fate. So you have the character of Madame Desnoyers, the older woman with the younger daughter. They're both similar to Lola, the dancer. So the mother used to be a dancer, so she represents who Lola may become. Oh, she's also a single mother, duh. While her daughter desires above all to grow up and be a dancer. So even when Roland meets the daughter, he comments that she looks like Lola. And the daughter's name is Cecile. If you remember, Lola's real name is Cecile. So it's almost like this look at like predestiny. Are you following? Am I following?
100%. I noticed it like instantaneously. I didn't think about the mother necessarily the way that you just spoke about it, but I thought about the daughter definitely as like the young version, like the dreamer kind of version of her. But I didn't even consider the aspect that the mother is sort of like what her life may become, you know, being a mom and depending on what happens with, you know, Michel, I think is his name.
Yeah.
You know, if he does come back or not. So yeah, it's a really good comparison to the two of them.
Totally. And what I was trying to explain earlier poorly, but now you just reminded me because his name is Michel, is that motif of faith and how it affects their lives. And just connecting that again to Umbrellas, Lola keeps her faith. Michel comes back. It works out. With Catherine Deneuve, she loses her faith. She ends up with Roland, spoilers. She loses her faith, so her ending is tragic. So it's interesting to see these subtle differences and how one is positive and one is negative, you know?
Yeah, no, and it is interesting to me how he decided to show like a very clear, like very like on the nose parallel with Cecile. Is it Cecile or Cecile, the young girl?
Cecile, yeah.
Who meets the Navy guy that Lola's been hanging out with. I'm blanking on his name right now, but going around to the fair and like all the exact same things she just got done telling Roland. And here, it's like, I don't normally love when movies do that where it's like so like obvious the parallel, but in a sense with this one, it made it like more wholesome to me to like watch almost like what she probably went through while she's like describing it. You get to see like a visual and like watch how easy it is for a young girl to fall into either category of like giving up and moving on or being that dreamer. And I think it really showcases that nicely.
Oh, I love it. I love it so much. But I think this also makes a great segue into our next film, unless there's anything that you want to add to Lola.
No, I adored it. I think it's my least favorite of the three only because I just feel like it's like just starting something, but it's just not like quite there with every aspect. But I thought it was delightful.
And just again, like I just want to reiterate one more time before we move on. This was his feature film debut. Like, what? How does that happen? It's just so immaculately built. It's crazy to me.
Agreed.
So next up, now we're getting into the good. The Umbrellas of Cherbourg from 1964, starring the impossibly beautiful Catherine Deneuve and Nino Castelnuovo, I think his name is. I'm pronouncing it wrong.
Better than I would.
But yeah, this is his most well-known work, easily. And let's do another brief Letterboxd description because that seems to be the play. According to Letterboxd, it says, this simple romantic tragedy begins in 1957. Guy, a 20-year-old French auto mechanic, has fallen in love with a 17-year-old Geneviève, an employee in her widowed mother's chic but financially embattled umbrella shop. On the evening before Guy is to leave for a 2-year tour of combat in Algeria, he and Geneviève make love. She becomes pregnant and must choose between waiting for Guy's return or accepting an offer of marriage from a wealthy diamond merchant. Holy, I feel like that even gives away too much.
I was thinking that when I first watched this movie that description was too long because I feel like you know too much going into it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
especially
I don't like
compared to Lola. Like I read like a sentence, and this I wasn't expecting myself to keep reading.
No, they could have just kept it at like mother owns an umbrella shop. She's in love.
Yeah.
There's
a tragedy.
Next?
That's it. Yeah. But okay, well, the one thing that I am happy that's missing from that is the fact that the movie is divided into 3 parts. So we have the departure, when Guy leaves at the start, obviously. Then we have the absence while he's gone, obviously. And that's from, I think, January to April of 1958. And it's the movie starts in 1957. And then we finally have the return from 1959 to 1963. Yeah, so a lot of time passes in this film, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I was kind of forgetting that it was released in the mid 60s, but it goes back and almost leads up to present time. So for some reason I wasn't thinking it went back that far. So that's a good reminder that it actually takes place over like 5.5 years, roughly.
Yeah, I mean, if it starts in 1957, ends in 1963. So
wow. Yeah, I guess a lot of time does go by. Well, it makes sense though by the end, obviously, with the kids.
And especially if you think about her too. I mean, those are like she's still a teenager at the start, you know? So like imagine just the mental progression for her as well throughout those years. It's not like now when you're, you know, in your late 20s or early 30s where that time frame doesn't really matter that much, but when you're a teenager, it does.
Yeah, and it definitely is interesting to like watch movies that are set in that time and remember how normal it was for like a 17-year-old or 16-year-old to be dating like a adult man.
Yeah, so weird. So weird. But one thing of note with the Umbrellas of Cherbourg that we didn't say yet is that the entire movie is sung, literally all of it. Not a single word is spoken. And I know for me personally, as someone who's incredibly picky with musicals, this was a challenge the first time around. For the first, I want to say maybe like 5 minutes. Ash, I know you by and large enjoy your musicals. What were your initial thoughts when you first realized, oh my God, the singing will not end?
Yeah, so this is my second watch of it, and I'm really happy I actually rewatched it again because the first time I watched it, the singing, it took me about like 20 minutes to get used to it. Wow. And then once I got used to it, it got like better for me. But I was bummed because I loved the aesthetic of the first chunk of the movie. So I was like so not bothered, but just focused on the singing the first time I watched it. This time, the second time, just didn't even like make a difference for me at all. I was so like used to it. So I do feel like a second watch helps adjust to that singing aspect of it because that opening scene is so good. And it's such a bummer when you're like focused too much on reading and listening, they're singing, and it's like it just throws you off a little bit. So second watch does wonders for this movie.
I agree. And what I always tell people is I use myself as a point of reference as someone who, like I said, I don't usually jive with musicals. I'm very picky. But if you stick through those initial minutes of readjustment, you don't even notice the singing or you don't even notice that things are being sung. Don't you think? Like to me, it just felt like words. Like it's fine.
It's, honestly, I think because it's in French, if that was like Americans singing for an hour and a half, I honestly probably wouldn't even like it. But because it sounds so beautiful, it makes it better somehow.
Yeah. And I think an additional thing that helped me with, I guess, categorizing it is that I don't even think of it as a musical, as weird as that is to say, and bear with me, it carries elements that would relate it to an opera. So the entire thing is sung formally. It's very operatic. And Demy himself said that his childhood was a huge inspiration for his movies. And this love for like a grand spectacle, let's call it, that was really pushed through by going to the opera with his family as a kid. So there are these little associations and nods he makes throughout this movie and through all of his work that relate to his family. His father was a mechanic, much like how Guy is in the movie, while his mother was a part-time hairdresser, although there's nobody that's a hairdresser in this one. That's in A Slightly Pregnant Man. But
in
she
Lola,
also worked...
though, isn't the hairdresser the guy? Isn't there like a hairdresser that he goes to work for, get the briefcase from?
Yeah, you're right. So it is in there. So then it's in 2 movies. There you go. So she worked part-time. His mother worked part-time as a hairdresser. She was also a gas station person who pumps.
Like attendant? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Me doesn't have a car, obviously. But that's another job that we see in the Umbrellas of Cherbourg. Yeah. So, I mean, is there anything you want to add? I went on a tangent, but about the operatic element versus a typical musical.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that The Young Girls is the only like true musical out of these 3 because like the first one, like you mentioned, it didn't have the funding and it is definitely more like score oriented. But then this one being sung, I wouldn't call that a musical because there's not like numbers. Everything is just speaking song.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I never really considered it being like an opera, but I'm not super familiar with operas, but I think that makes more sense that that's sort of, it's like bringing like life even more to life than it already is. It's just like a way of speaking. It doesn't feel like a musical to me. I don't like have moments where I'm like, oh, look at the way they sung that. That sounded so great. Like it's all just like, they're just talking. They're just living their lives and you're just listening to it in a different fashion. So I think it works wonders that all three of these have actually different types of music used. I think it actually kind of makes them able to be more like spread apart. Like you can actually kind of break them into like their own thing. Whereas if they were all just pure musicals, I think they would maybe run together a little too much, especially like Umbrellas and Young Girls, I feel like.
Totally. That's actually a really good observation. I didn't even think of that, but I absolutely agree. I also think another funny observation as well is that I think that Demy's very self-aware, and I'm pretty sure there's a character at the mechanic shop at the start of the film that says something like, I don't like the opera, I like the cinema, all those people who sing, it's painful to me, and I was just like laughing at that. So he does make these cheeky little jokes. He knows.
He does, because he talks about loving movies like 3 times, and they're like, you already said that.
Oh man, I don't even remember that, but I believe you. Oh, I love that that's repeated.
I forget exactly what it is, but he's like, yeah, I love the movies. And they're like, you already said that. Like, he just keeps repeating himself to like really hone in on it.
Own it. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, nevertheless, Demy loved old Hollywood musicals. And it was actually after the Second World War when these American musicals really became available in France, and he was just so captivated by them. And Umbrellas really does carry that love for musicals that we later see replicated even more to a true musical in The Young Girls. But it's also worthwhile noting that around that time that the war was happening, there was the Allied bombing of Nantes, where he's from. And that happened in 1943. And that's what kind of sparked this love of dreaming for an ideal. It was a traumatic moment. Everybody was striving for happiness, and I think that that's a motif that appears in his films. Don't you say?
Yeah, no, I would definitely say so.
Yeah, and I'm curious here, and there'll be some follow-up chatter, but does Umbrella strike you as a romantic film or more of one that's a tragedy?
I feel like it is a bit more tragic, just because I feel like the type of love that they have already is sort of like unattainable. For most people, just because it is such that fairy tale love. And I think it is a lot of more heartbreak, even like tragedy, even from like the mother's perspective. And then obviously from like our main character's perspective, and even to think about like their future children and like kind of some of the heartbreak they'll have to go through because of the way they're, I don't know, it screams more tragedy than it does happiness to me. But I think in the moment to some of the characters, I think those moments feel like pure happiness. But they're so easily ripped away that it's just, it's more tragic to me than it is happy.
So I knew you were going to say that. I absolutely agree. And that's the thing. I was reading a quote by Demy himself, who flat out said that The Umbrellas of Cherbourg is not a romantic film. He saw it as a realistic film. And again, those lingering thoughts of the war that I mentioned earlier that he experienced were translated into it as the romance of our leads is broken up by the Algerian War. And Demy said, quote, "The people are very realistic and have plenty of problems, and in the end, their life is destroyed as a result of the Algerian War. It's a very cruel film and a very realistic one." Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah. I mean, he literally leaves to go to war, and that's what starts the demise of everything in their relationship. So
yeah,
makes sense.
So, I mean, as cruel as it is, it's also just breathtakingly beautiful and colorful and just injected with so much life. You have this beautiful synchronicity of the visuals that's always there. Like, the one that sticks out to me is the scene in Genevieve's apartment that she has with her mom. And you'll notice that the bow on her hair matches the wallpaper. And then her mom comes into the room. She's talking to her and she's carrying an apple, which then matches the same shade of the bedroom that she walks into, and so on and so forth. I mean, did you pick up on this like crazy synchronicity?
The second time I definitely picked up on like more, like even down to like being in the kitchen, she's wearing red and she's cutting a bunch of tomatoes, and then like the walls are green and the tomato vines are green, and then they walk back into the other room and it's pink and green and she's wearing a pink dress, and it's the blue. Whenever there's blue on screen in that movie, it's not as often as there is like pink and red. It's just, Out of this world.
Totally. And kind of to touch on what you were saying earlier, but whenever I watch it, I just wish I spoke fluent French so I didn't have to pay attention to the subtitles and I can just like
Yes.
watch these insanely beautiful visuals because they're just an explosion of color. And what's clever here is that the colors also serve as a tool to interpret the character's emotions. So, did you notice that when things started getting sad, the colors would become more muted? Even when Geneviève has that initial resistance of marrying Roland, who's now wealthy, by the way, after Lola, those bright shades become more pastel. And it's not even just the colors that give you more insight. It's also seen through the wardrobe, through the way our leads look themselves. Did you notice as the story goes on, Genevieve's hair goes from being down to like progressively more tight, tight, tight. And then in the final act, it's like a crazy beehive.
Yeah. And she also starts to wear like more white. And it's just like she starts to like lose that little bit of fire that was kind of in her eye in the beginning, and that little bit of like that same kind of dreamer kind of sense that she had at the beginning, and she's all bright and happy and her makeup's all perfect, and then it slowly kind of starts to change and be just more dull. I guess that's kind of, that's sometimes how life gets, though. You kind of, I don't know, it's kind of depressing, but it kind of fits.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. No, I'm laughing to like hide the absolute sadness I feel after I finish this movie. I mean, and also just like back to her hair, I think to me that signifies how confined she is to her life. Like,
yes,
it's so depressing to think about, but it's true. There is no escape. Like, this is what she chose. And at this point, I mean, as we were saying earlier, she's still in her early 20s by the time this movie ends, yet she looks like life has worn her down already. Don't you think?
Yeah. Definitely.
Oh, I mean, yeah. I'm just getting so sad and so emotional.
I know.
About this. I'm not gonna cry.
I found out that watching this the second time, though, I could kind of not read it as much, and I could just kind of enjoy, because I already knew what was going to happen. So I didn't have to read every little word to like feel like I could follow. Was just so nice to notice so many little like details when you're watching it, not having to read everything. Especially when they're singing, it requires a bit more attention because you don't want to get distracted by their singing. But yeah, this movie is so reminiscent of La La Land, which obviously I'm a huge fan of. And I feel like this one out of all of them has the most connection to it, just because it's been like down to the, we're in this month and now we're in winter and now we're in, even all that I feel like is so very much La La Land. So it's clearly inspiration, which I'm not surprised. I think this one might be my favorite, but I tend to like depressing stories. So I guess I don't know what that says about me.
There you go.
I love when the mom's like, people only die for love in the movies, or die of love in the movies. I love all the little references to cinema throughout this one. And I guess I'm a sucker for like a possibly right person, wrong time type of story. And it's like, yeah, maybe they would have worked, maybe they wouldn't have, but that's not how life works. You just make choices and you have to live with it. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've only seen, you're going to kill me for this. I've only seen La La Land twice. Once when it came out and then once a few years later. So my memory isn't as good as maybe it is for you, but I really like that you touched on the different seasons changing, because I did not even think of that. But we also have to mention another important aspect of The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, which is that obviously phenomenal score by Michel Legrand. That actually garnered, I think, 2 Academy Award nominations. Didn't win. Kind of sucks. I think it should have. But this score just leaves me breathless. What did you think of it?
It's so heartbreaking. I can hear like bits of La La Land in this one and Young Girls with the scores. I'm just like, 100% they inspired this completely, because they give you that same like sense of just feeling so deeply for these characters and like the choices they had to make, especially that ending score at the gas station. It just breaks me. And the train station too is like one of the saddest scenes in the whole entire movie. Her face is just so sad whenever she's like down on life. It's just the saddest thing, yet it's like the most beautiful face ever. So
ever. But yeah,
like, I mean, I'm so
happy ever. I'm so happy that you mentioned that train station scene. I love that one. It's also just impressive from a technical standpoint. Did you notice it's just one continuous shot that just pulls back? And then you hear that score. And I mean, the first time I watched it, I was sobbing buckets on my couch. But yeah, I mean, that's all thanks to Legrand's score. And he scored, I believe, almost all of Demy's films, save for 4. Yeah, save for 4. And with Umbrellas, that score to me is just as important as everything else. And that's how Legrand and Demy intended it to be. So Legrand was guided by the screenplay that Demy wrote. And the structure of the score took into consideration all those tracking shots, like the one we just mentioned at the train station. There's also the one where I think they're standing on a street and they're being pulled along like a dolly or something. So you took all of
that kind of stood out to me this time watching it. I noticed like they're supposed to be like on the bike, but they're like moving.
Yes.
How are they moving?
Yes, they must have been on a dolly or something. But it perfectly blends with the music that's going on, the rhythm, the timing, even when there's close-ups. Everything is just used to maximum effect together, blended. And it just really conveys the emotions our characters feel through subtle shifts. You listen to it during moments of Guy and Genevieve's romantic scenes. The notes are held longer, while when they're away from one another, the score just soars into like tragedy, like we were saying, the scene at the train station. It rips my heart into shreds. And then even the ending of the movie itself is just so powerful to me. And is there anything you want to add to this? I could just babble on.
I mean, that ending is one of my favorites. I just think it's perfect. Definitely, again, La La Land took a lot from that, with like even down to like the gas station looking like how they talked about, and the office being there that she talked about. And it's just like, okay, of course she pulls up randomly in the city for the night. She pulls into his gas station. So yeah, that just is like very cinema-esque, that you would just happen to be there at the right time in the right moment. And then both of them naming their kids the same thing. It's just like, how much more can you crush me?
Yeah, totally. And I'm so happy that you bring up like this sort of influence from Hollywood as well, and just other movies too, because the whole movie is a beautiful amalgamation of that Hollywood musical glamour. You could even argue that the umbrellas themselves are a motif, are a nod to Singing in the Rain. You could argue.
I did think about Singing in the Rain when I saw all the umbrellas.
Same. So it does carry all those elements, but at the same time, it's not a studio production. And that's why I think it could technically qualify as a member of the French New Wave to a degree. Everything is lit to perfection. It's super colorful, but this was shot in Cherbourg. It was not shot at a studio. These are real places. Not to mention that it's not this sort of glitzy fairy tale you'd get from an MGM musical, because things don't work out. And it's a very bitter reality, right? Is there anything you want to add here?
I mean, no, this one to me, I think that's why I like it the most. It just feels the most grounded in reality. I'm a huge sucker for like fairy tale-esque stories, but the other two to me feel much more unrealistic of how life actually goes. Maybe not at that time period, but to relate to them now. I think this one is like a story that can be told forever as far as like how life goes. I think there was a line that I just loved. I think it's Guy who says it, but correct me if I'm wrong if you remember. But it's like something about like maybe happiness makes me sad, or is what makes me sad, or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that was Guy.
I think it is in that last section when he's like kind of coming back home and realizing the return. And I don't know why that to me, I just like, I love it because I feel like it kind of means that like sometimes like trying to like accept your reality of like he's, got a kid and a wife and like this life that would sound happy on paper, he's really sad and he's like his life didn't go how he wanted it to. And again, because of the war, like he didn't have a choice. He had to leave. Like these aren't choices he got to make. They were kind of made for him. And so I don't know, that to me just like really stuck with me. Like sometimes that happy ending isn't really what makes you truly happy. It might make you sad, but that's life. You have to just keep, moving on. So I think that's kind of like for me, like the message of this movie is just that choices are made and life happens and things are out of your control sometimes, but you have to sort of just keep moving along and stick to the choices you made because you can't go back.
Totally. And I think to piggyback on that point, I think that if you pay attention, there is no villain here. Roland, even some people would make him out to be a villain in another movie because Genevieve doesn't end up with the love of her life, but he's still a good guy. And to go back to your point, I think that the evil antagonist of this movie is time and it's fate. And I think that's what makes it even more crushing. Yeah, I mean, the only other person I could say is maybe slightly conniving. I don't know if you noticed it. It's like a split second when Genevieve marries Roland, the girl who Guy ends up with, I'm blanking
Madeline
her name right now. Yeah, she's outside of the wedding and you see it's like a very brief split second of her like,
She's the closest to a villain, yeah, I would say that you could find. But even she seems like she's making the choice out of like love for him, like you should know about this because it's not, even though she knows it's going to hurt him, she feels like, well then maybe I can, like she's doing it out of her own self-interest, but at the same time she's not like a bad person. So
Yeah, I agree. So then all you're left with is fate and time, which is like real life, unfortunately. And I think it's cool that people really do resonate to this movie to this day, as you do, as I do, as so many people do, because it is so grounded in reality. And as we said, Chazelle cited Umbrellas of Cherbourg as a huge inspiration for La La Land, and that repeats the exact same motif, but in modern times. Is there anything else you'd want to add to that, or even that connection between them there?
no, I mean, I think it's great how it inspired, but I do think that he's able to put like a modern day twist on it. But I think it just shows like that's like a timeless story, like I mentioned already, because that's set in 2016 or 14. It's like you have cell phones, you have ways of connecting with people at any time. And life still gets in the way sometimes, and things still don't always work out. It's not always the right time.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to like get to see such a timeless story told, about 50 years later, roughly, or more. And it still kind of works, even though obviously the relationship and how fast they get together and all those things are different. But I think it really is a story about people in life and just time and love, but not always just like romantic love even too. Just, even like your relationship with your mother and, just sort of how that influence can go. Like, I think a lot of people can relate to like your mom having a say in your love life or decisions you're making when you're a teenager. So I think there's just so much to relate to here in comparison to the other ones. And I think it is just because like this one's a little bit deeper in the sense that it's not going to all work out for everybody involved. And not that the other ones had that for every character, but I think they are more fairy tale-esque in that way to where there's a lot more hope and a lot more positive happening versus here where there's a lot more, sadness at the end of the day.
Doom and gloom. Yeah.
Yeah.
So before we move on to Young Girls of Rochefort, I do want to share a quote by Demy that truly encapsulates what there is to love about Umbrellas, and it has a lot to do with what you just said about why you love it. So the quote goes, "That's how life is. We live, we suffer, and yet music is beautiful, colors are beautiful. Even though we're going through the worst troubles and sufferings, red is always lovely, blue is always lovely, and the music of Mozart is always beautiful." I mean, that's wonderful.
Oh, I love every word of that. That is
I know.
exactly a perfect way to think about this film. I mean, the colors really are what, like, I feel like bring you out of the darkness there and the music. So I think in life in general, music is a thing for a lot of people that helps them through dark times and looking at the bright things and going out in the real world and like seeing people and things. It can kind of bring you out of that suffering that so many people go through with, different struggles in their life. So I love that.
That was beautifully put, Ash. I just want to pause for a second. That was beautiful. So for my personal favorite now, we get to migrate to the last one of the day, The Young Girls of Rochefort from 1967. Before I get into asking you your initial thoughts, letterbox summary, I guess, since we're doing that.
We'll see what this one's like.
Yeah, I think this one's a good combination of the first two. It's not too long or not too short. It's a Goldilocks of Letterboxd reviews. Goldilocks, was that the one? Yeah.
Yeah, just right.
Yeah. Delphine and Solange are two sisters living in Rochefort. They are both looking for love without being aware that their ideal partner is very close.
Who wrote the one for Umbrellas? Because
I know.
I don't
gives
understand.
away the entire thing. But I mean, right off the bat, even from this like little snippet, you can tell it's so much more chipper than Umbrellas, right? Like there's not that doom and gloom. And it's interesting because they're both musicals, right? And while I love Umbrellas for being more like an opera that may look like an MGM musical, it's a total breakdown of that, while the Young Girls, on the other hand, embraces the Hollywood movement or the Hollywood musical movement and the escapism that comes with it to the maximum. What do you think?
Absolutely. This movie went in so many directions that I was just like, wait, what? What's happening? Yeah, it just sucks you into the world. And I think that's why it's a bit longer. And I think that does work in its favor in comparison to the other ones, that you get a little bit more story going on here and a lot more characters to follow.
Totally. And I mean, it even includes, just to hark back to it being such an homage to the golden age of musicals, there's the addition of Gene Kelly as an American in France, which is even a nod to his own film from, I think, 1951, An American in Paris. I don't know if you noticed, there was also, I can't remember his name right now, George Chakiris. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But he was in West Side Story and he played one of the carnival guys, one of the two.
Oh, I did not make that connection.
Yeah. So, I mean, what were your initial thoughts? Did you see that this one felt more, I mean, you probably did, that it felt more of like a Hollywood musical than the previous one?
Yeah, I mean, from that opening scene, obviously, it feels a lot bigger, a lot more, in that sense, to La La Land, like, just, like, more, like, over the top, like, people getting out of their cars on, like, the middle of rush hour. This one felt much more like that style, where it's just, like, they're all through the streets, they're driving all this stuff in. I wasn't quite sure, obviously, what that all meant at first, because I didn't realize they were setting up for the parade that they were going to be doing, or the show. But, yeah, it was just, like, I know something big's about to happen. We're going to see lots of colors, lots of people, lots of dancing. So it definitely sets the tone of the movie really, really well from that first scene.
And I mean, that appearance of Gene Kelly as well when he first meets Solange in the street and we get that song and dance number.
I love that song.
I dare anybody to watch this and not have the biggest smile on their face. I mean, it is movie magic.
He's so handsome.
Yeah, I was over the moon during that entire sequence.
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorite scenes when they first meet. It feels so fairy tale-esque, like drop your stuff and he's there to pick it up, and it feels like so nostalgic in a way, even though this movie is obviously like from the 60s, so it's probably set the tone for a lot of other movies, but it just still felt so like nostalgic in a way. Like we've seen those moments so many times in movies, but yet it's still always so special for the characters. So it made me think that she was just like a teenager again, like sitting there, like falling in love at first sight. Obviously he's a bit older than her, but I just adored him.
He's
Absolutely
fantastic. And I mean, the second you see his smile, I smile, everyone's smiling. It's amazing. And yeah, I mean, for me, this whole entire movie just stands as my all-time favorite musical. It's just a happy drug in cinema form. I think that's what I texted you last night. But while I was prepping for today's episode, I noticed that this movie carries the closest pattern to Lola, where the characters are all searching for each other, yet they're kept apart until the end of the movie. And I have a sneaky suspicion that if he had a bigger budget for Lola, it would look something similar to the Young Girls of Rochefort. What do you think?
Yes, but I'm glad it didn't in a way. I think it worked better because there was less characters in that one. I think it almost worked better the way that they did it. I mean, I actually liked that it was in black and white, weirdly enough. I think it's kind of nice to see like a progression for him, like, you know, this kind of more simplistic black and white moving into this big motion picture musical, like, you know, 6 years later. I don't know. It feels like you're almost watching like his progression as a director too, even though I know I don't have as much knowledge of him as you do, but it felt like very like a natural progression of how he would kind of enhance his movies. So I think it worked better here because there's a lot more characters. Like, yeah, I know that they have like the teenage girl and the sailor and Lola, but I think here it's like you have a lot more main characters. So I think it worked a bit better that there was so much like intermingling and they're all meeting, but not the right people are meeting, you know, up until the end. And it's so much fun to follow.
Yes, all of it. And I mean, just the result of it all is just dazzling. Much like Umbrellas, the colors here pop like crazy. Everything matches again.
Yes.
Kind of similar to Umbrellas with that scene in the apartment. Here, in the apartment of the sisters, for example, Solange's pink dress matches the outline of the wallpaper, which then matches the pink on Delphine's robe, but the pink on that robe has blue on it. And that echoes the shutters of the window that are outside of her apartment. Did you notice that nothing is accidental?
I did not notice the last thing you just said, but I noticed the other stuff. Like, I feel like another watch, I would just continuously notice more and more color. But this one definitely was the most vibrant, even weirdly enough, more than Umbrellas. And I think it has to do with the upbeat nature of it versus the more depressing tone. So I think he uses colors well in both of them. But I think here it brought out like a much more like smiley, upbeat, like kind of enjoyment for the viewer, just because obviously the messaging in it is a bit more easy to be in a good headspace, I guess, than with Umbrellas. But I think he just uses colors so well. I kept getting so annoyed though. I kept wanting them to like be wearing different colors at certain points because I was like, oh, with her red hair, she would look so good in this color. But then it was like, as a blonde, she was wearing like yellow. And I was like, no, you guys should switch outfits. So silly, but I kept thinking about that.
I love it. No, I mean, my fashion school background with costuming, I thought of that too as well immediately. I was like, well, you could have done this better, but I digress.
Still love it. Yeah.
Still love it. And I mean, a lot of love went into this movie itself and making it. And I think I mentioned briefly at the start that Varda really pushed after his death to re-release his stuff, but she also directed a documentary on the Young Girls of Rochefort, which is on the Criterion channel. I strongly suggest checking it out, but it gives all this background information information of what the set was like when this movie was being made, I discovered that the crew painted over 10,000 shutters and doors in Rochefort, over 40,000 square meters, and just this whole town was ablaze with these vibrant colors during that time. And it's an experience that the residents just never forgot. They hold it very dear to them. And even Catherine Deneuve in the doc, she says, if you're shooting outdoors with music, it turns into a party. And the whole thing is just an injection of joy. Even the cinematography, which consists of like so many tracking and panning shots, it just further adds to this like spontaneity or fluidity to the characters that are just singing and dancing. And it's just this like candy colored fantasy world that's just so unashamed to be paying homages to Hollywood while also being its own thing. Don't you think?
Yeah, 100%. I think especially even with like some of the like over the top like subplots and over the top like characters and the way their love stories have gone, it feels so much like just these like old Hollywood movies where you're just like, wait, what's happening? Like, what's this love story? What's this serial killer going? It just feels so like it wouldn't make sense, but because it's just like this big over the top production, like you're just like, yeah, of course there's that, and of course like the mom is with the guy who runs the music shop, and has like it's just like everything I kept finding out, I was just like, oh, of course that's how it's gonna go. Like it felt so natural in the story progression, even though like on paper it all sounds so like hectic. Insane. You know, as far as so many different little subplots that were going on.
Totally. And I'm happy that you mentioned that because we haven't touched on it earlier. But I do want to say for those of you listening, this movie does contain a serial killer subplot, which is crazy to think about considering it's such a happy musical.
I was so like, wait, what is happening?
What?
And I thought it was Lola. Oh yeah. I guess that's the big connection is that. And how old would she have been at that point then?
So that's the one thing that we're not gonna get into because that's where I'm giving him a free pass. But yeah, the timeline would not work. Like it just wouldn't work.
But I still appreciate that he included all of these characters and all of them. We will not analyze the math there.
The math there, that's not even accurate.
It's not mathing.
No, but along with all of that, I think it's also, besides all the fun stuff that's going on, it's also very clever and self-reflexive movie if you pay attention to the lyrics, which is also kind of similar to the Umbrellas if I think about it now that I'm thinking about it. But at one point when the sisters are telling the carnival performers what music they'd like them to evoke with their dance number, they ask if they would prefer some Michel Legrand, which is obviously the composer that we're listening to who wrote everything. And then later on, after they actually do that number, one of the guys comments how sick he is of sailors and girls, which again is a nod to Lola and her fling with a sailor. So it just makes you wish you spoke fluent French so you could catch even more of that clever wordplay or those connections, which I mean are just obviously so clearly there.
Right. And especially because translation is not always like 100% in every language. There's not always a word for that word. So I do think that if you could actually like speak it, it might have a bigger impact with some of those little hidden lines like that.
Yeah, and nods. But yeah, I mean, I also think it's worthwhile noting that Demy himself believed that this movie carried melancholy tones, like kind of buried deep under it. And he even said, I would like people to accept this lightness, but not take it lightly. So there are pockets of genuine despair, in my opinion, like that moment Delphine just misses the sailor at the cafe, and that took me out the first time I watched it. It really reminded me of Umbrellas, and again, Michel Legrand's score is just like thrusting you into this sadness. What did you think of this scene?
I was like screaming at my TV. I was like, are you kidding me? I was so convinced he was going to come back again. I was like, wait. I was looking actually in the window in the back behind her. I was like waiting to see him walk back by again because I was just like, no, it is. I mean, God, the ending did kind of bum me out because I liked her character the most and I really wanted something good to happen for her, but we just don't know. It might have.
But if you think about it, and I mean, this is where you can start bringing in your own interpretation of it. He enters in that final scene, he enters one of the trucks as the carnival people are going away. He enters her truck, does he not?
That's what I wasn't sure about. I wasn't sure if because I was not going to lie, it was almost midnight, so I was getting a little tired when I got to the end, and I didn't know if it was hers or if it was somebody else's, because I thought he would have had a reaction more instantly if it was her, because she was sitting on the edge because the other girl got in first.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
I
maybe.
don't know.
I mean, in my opinion, and I've seen it now, gosh, I don't know how many times, but I would like to think that even if it's the wrong vehicle, they're still getting out at the same destination. So in
Yeah.
my mind, once they get out of those vehicles and see one another, boom, romance, we're all happy.
Yeah.
Maybe not, but I would like to think so. But of course, besides that, there's also the lingering real life sadness to this, which I don't know if you know about, but Catherine Deneuve and Francois Dorlac, Delphine and Solange, they were real life sisters. And 3 months after this movie was released, Francois Dorlac, she sadly passed away in a car accident, and she was only 25. Did you know about this?
I did not.
It's very sad. So
I just got chills.
Yeah, so it really is just also this nice relic to these two sisters who did this movie together and loved that time on set together. And this is all actually talked about in that Varda documentary on the Criterion channel. But yeah, above all, I think this is such a underappreciated musical because people usually talk about Umbrellas. But I think it still also served almost as equal inspiration for La La Land. What do you think?
Yeah, I think more so in like the bigger numbers. I think so. And when Solange was playing that flute, that song is 100% almost identical to one in La La Land. I can't think of the name of the song in La La Land, but it might even be like Mia and Sebastian's like theme, their main song theme. I swear it sounds almost like 80% the same music. So it was 100% inspired for that one. And she plays it like it gets played throughout the whole movie, but she plays it on different instruments. So it's like, it's interesting to me. It kind of changes its sound throughout the movie. And then as she gets to like kind of her happy ending, you don't really hear it anymore. So it's almost, to me, that was like her little like sound for her life or something. Like once she found what she was looking for, it was like she didn't need to play that anymore. Kind of thing is kind of how it seemed.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, for me, as I was saying, I think earlier on in this episode, his films, particularly this trilogy, they just resonate. And I think the older I get and the more life experiences I get, everything just hits so much harder. The heartbreak, the excitement, just all these human emotions that Demy captures so perfectly. So for that reason, he's one of my favorite French filmmakers, at least from this era. Is there anything you want to add before we wrap up these 3 by Jacques Demy?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone should definitely check out these films because I know for me, like I love finding out about a new director, and especially when I like multiple of their films, I'll definitely be watching more. I don't know if any other ones will be quite as good for me as Young Girls and Umbrellas, but I just adore the like general messaging that he brings forward, but he does it in that fairy tale way to where, to me, it's like, okay, yeah, these sisters wanting to like just find love so quickly. And it's like, I'm sad, I'm bored. Like, I want to find love and I want to, have this joyous life. It actually like makes sense. We all want that. It just, in the movie, it comes across in a more fairy tale-esque way. Like running into somebody while picking up your brother and all these kind of like unrealistic scenarios. But if you think about it, we all kind of encounter like random little scenarios and meet people that way. So at the end of the day, they're all so grounded, even though they feel very fairy tale-esque. And I think that's just like the colors and the way he goes about telling the story. But I love that all of these stories are still such like real human stories about just people, like young people, especially like figuring out their lives. And I just adore movies like that. They're not really coming of age, I guess, but I feel like you could argue that there's aspects of that within all of them, which is like one of my favorite genres. So they just resonate all very well with me in different ways. I think this one is the most fun, obviously, of the 3. I think the characters are the best. And I think when the 2 sisters are on screen, I was just absolutely glued. There was some moments where it was like not them on screen and it took me out of it for a minute, just briefly. Yeah. But they really make it for me in this one especially.
I love them. And I love these movies. I would also check out really quickly while it's in my mind, A Slightly Pregnant Man.
Yes.
Also with Catherine Deneuve and Marcello Mastroianni, who was huge in Fellini's movies. And he plays a pregnant man. So
yeah, I will definitely be checking that one out because I'm a huge fan of hers now after watching these 2. I'll watch anything she's in.
Yeah. Insanely beautiful. But yeah, okay, my friend, it looks like that is all for today. I can't thank you enough for coming on. I'd love to have you back. But do you want to let everyone know where they can find you or shout out your podcast? Shout it all out.
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for having me and having this discussion because it was a lot of fun. I feel like I don't really know anybody else who's watched these movies, so I wouldn't have anyone else to discuss it with anyway. So yeah, no, thank you. Okay, as far as socials, for my personal stuff, it's just Ash vs. Movies. So like Ash vs. Movies on Instagram, TikTok. And then for the pod, Love, Death, and Movies. Yeah, thank you. Me, Harry, and Byron, every week we release an episode and it's a lot of fun. We talk about older movies and sometimes newer movies. And then you can find us there on Instagram, it's just Love, Death, and Movies pod. And then on TikTok, I think it's the same thing. So if you just type in Love, Death, and Movies podcast, you can find us. We're on everything. And on Letterboxd, I'm also Ash versus Movies.
Yes, follow her Letterboxd. It's also incredible. But yeah, thank you for coming and hanging out at McFly's Movie House. And I will talk to you soon. Mwah.
Thank you.